Introduction to Further Ramblings of Railwaymen. Since writing about my experiences regarding my life on the footplate at Guildford shed, the question I was constantly being asked was, when am I going to write another book? This got me thinking, and although I retired from the railway in 2009, I've always remained good friends with dozens of ex-work colleagues, all of whom have their own stories to tell. Railwaymen love to talk about the old days, particularly amongst themselves, exchanging idle chat about a moment in their careers, such as Pat Kinsella's story of the Snodland cement train. Within every railway community across the length and breadth of Britain, there must be many memories similar to Pat's, as well as so many more left unspoken, often because they're so preposterous that you couldn't make it up. Some of these men worked with me at Guildford, but to give an idea of what other depots were like, I've included some ramblings from men that worked at Fratton, Eastleigh, Salisbury, Weymouth and the Isle of Wight. As I remember it, the generations of railwaymen that I encountered in the steam days didn't moan or complain that they were owed anything. They simply got on with the job. Yet the reminiscences of working class people are seldom considered to be part of important history. Having said about the task of recording several railwaymen's experiences for posterity, as I am now glad I did, as some have sadly passed away, it turns out that their everyday lives were far from ordinary. And let me be perfectly honest about this. When the time comes to leave us, as they must, as we all must at the end of the day, the memories they leave behind are beyond price. The result is further ramblings of railwaymen. I hope these ramblings give you as much enjoyment as we had compiling them. So having got the introduction out the way, we start with some wonderful stories of steam days at Guildford Loco, written by Pat Kinsella. I first met Pat in 1961 when I started work as a 15-year-old engine cleaner at Guildford. It was the start of a great friendship that lasted throughout our railway careers and still continues today. Here are some of Pat's memories of his days at Guildford Motive Power Depot. My first meeting with Pat was in 1961 when I was a 15-year-old cleaner, at that time working in the boilersmith shop. I was keen to learn the fireman's trade, so not having much to do in the afternoon, I helped Pat prepare his locomotive. The incident of me treading on a rusty nail whilst doing so is well documented in my first book, so I won't go into it again here. However, we became firm friends, and once I became a farmer myself, I fired to Pat on a number of occasions and had some memorable trips. After moving to Woking when steam ended on the Southern in July 1967, I also worked with Pat as a second man and then as a fellow driver at Woking Mixed Traction Depot, once I'd passed for driving myself in 1969. In later years, when steam power returned to the Southern Metals, Pat was fortunate to work several auspicious steam-hauled services, one with 7P6F Class 70,000 Britannia, and rebuilt Merchant Navy Class 35028 Clan Line. Other steam-hauled trips followed, including the VSOE from Victoria to Portsmouth in aid of the Royal London Society for the Blind, and the first steam-hauled morning commuter train from Woking to Waterloo for 27 years. In my words, here are some of Pat's fascinating ramblings. Pat left school in April 1957 at 15 years of age, ready to take up an apprenticeship at Vickers Armstrong at Weybridge. But due to the apprentices not being able to start until after the company's summer break, he looked around for something to do in the meantime. After several rejections from different firms, he happened to pass the staff gate at Guildford Station and asked a couple of men in overalls who would he see about getting a job. Being engineman, they took him up to the governor's office, where he was offered a job as an engine cleaner. Pat was later issued a free pass to travel up to the Victorian Atmospheric London Bridge Medical Centre for his first medical, accompanied by his dad. "Drop your trousers and cough," requested the doctor. After impressing him, Pat redressed and then underwent an eyesight test, including looking at colour charts to try and distinguish different coloured numbers. The Ishihara colour test is an example of a colour perception test for red-green colour deficiencies. It was named after its designer, Dr. Shinobu Ishihara, a professor at the University of Tokyo, who first published his tests in 1917. Fit and healthy, with 666666 vision, meant he was ready to start on the road to becoming a driver. Come the day, 29th of April, Pat descended the 30 or so steps down to the locomotive shed with some trepidation, being as he knew absolutely nothing about railways in general, and locomotives in particular. He was literally stepping into the unknown. The site of the new Guildford locomotive shed in the late 19th century was positioned just south of the station, but because of the lack of space, the coal stage and fire cleaning facilities had to be situated opposite the station, with the Farnham Road Bridge traversing the two. Being that the depot was so close to town, a conservative town at that, it's a wonder they were allowed to build it there. What with all the pollution and noise emitted 24 hours a day, every day. A completely different view of Guildford Loco taken in 1965 from the top of Woodland Avenue. The new shed is shown in the foreground with the water tower to the left. Beyond the water tower, the canteen and bicycle shed, situated at the top of the concrete steps that led down to the loco, can also be clearly seen. The breakdown crane is visible to the right of the photograph. As there was no road access to the shed itself, it was perhaps an odd choice of location. Everything had to be brought in by rail wagons. There were two footways, one using the foot crossing south of the station platforms, and the other by the aforementioned steps leading down from Farnham Road Bridge. At the top of the steps was situated the canteen and bike shed. The canteen was very convenient and prices reasonable. The bike shed was very handy for soldiers who, having missed their last train home to Aldershot, could pinch a bike to ride back to camp, Pat's included. It had taken over a year paying for it, and now it was stolen. Pat had bought it on the never never, i.e. hire purchase. By all accounts, most of the bikes ended up being ditched in the Basingstoke Canal, which ran close to the barracks. The concrete steps led down to the signing on area and bottom office, where staff reported for duty. In this area were posted the locomen's rosters and duty diagrams, as well as late notices, etc. Shed staff, when they signed on, were issued a brass oval disc with a number stamped on it and the words inscribed along the top, Southern Railway. As a cleaner boy, Pat's number was number 52, and he wished he kept it. Attached to the bottom office was the ambulance and first aid room, and adjoining that was the engineman's cabin. Just across from the cabin was the outside Victorian toilet block. Each stall was about 20 inches wide, with double swing doors about 3 foot high, and so hung they were about 18 inches from the floor. Not being very private and dreadfully cold in winter, staff didn't hang about too long reading. It was said that one of the fitter's mates, a large man, had to reverse into the stall because he couldn't turn round when inside. Opposite the bottom office, a covered staircase led to the top office, where most of the depot administration was undertaken. When Pat started, there was a pay clerk, roster clerk and chief clerk at desks in the main room. In a smaller adjoining room, the depot master, Mr. George Stovold, and his assistant, Mr. Archie Martin, resided. They had a grandstand view of passing locomotives and the turntable. Turning right from the signing on point, one immediately entered the old shed through a wide naked doorway into a Victorian wonderland. Some locomotives would be shrouded in steam, others having had a shed day and just being lit up, their smoke with very little draught just about spilling out of chimneys, so much that the shed lights, nearly always turned on, were only a dim glow through that sweet pollution, the whole area looking very much like a scene from a Dickens novel. Just 2 yards inside the doorway stood what looked like to him a giant of a locomotive. Pat had never seen an engine close up before, and from ground level he was very impressed. He was later to learn about Guildford locomotives. A 395 class, jumbo, built 18 years before Queen Victoria died. 700 class, black motors, built in 1897 by Dubbs & Co. of Glasgow. It said so on a triangular plate on the centre wheel splasher. C classes, or Eastern Cs as they were known, were built in 1901. Amongst others were a couple of D1s and a number of M7s, motor tanks. For shed shunting, a little B4 class, 30086, Little Jim as she was fondly known to Guildford men, stood in the Stores Road. For major work, Ns, Us and Q1s were part of the Guildford establishment. This photograph shows a splendid view from Farnham Road Bridge of 700 class 30700 as she moves towards the coal stage, and a 12-car Portsmouth Express service comprised of 4 core stock in number 6 and 7 platform, waiting to leave for London on Tuesday the 1st of April 1958. Also shown is a Bulleid designed austerity Q1 class 33019, waiting for the signal at the end of platform 5 to allow it to enter the chalk tunnel and return to the loco shed. Guildford's gasometers can be seen in the background, and also the mobile canteen is just visible on the dock behind the tender of the Q1 class. Positioned outside the shed was the turntable, absolutely essential for getting locomotives into both the old and new sheds. It could accommodate all locos except visiting Pacifics. Bulleid Pacifics could only enter number 2 road, new shed, by driving straight across the turntable from the new pit. After getting a pep talk regarding good behaviour, etc., from Mr. Snodland, Pat was sent down to the stores to be issued with a set of ovals before starting work. Having a week's holiday with an auntie down in Somerset before he started his career, she warned him that senior colleagues would play tricks on him, and that it was vitally important not to get upset and to take it all in good fun. How right she was. The only thing was that when the charge hand cleaner, Mr. Reg Phone, instructed him to take a bucket of paraffin and some cloths, and then climb in under the boiler of a hot Q1 class and sit on the connecting anicentric rods to clean the big ends, he thought it was a leg pull. Reg assured him that provision was made for his safety, Pat's words, not his, by the attachment of a red not to be moved board to the locomotive tender. "Come on now, let's be having you. We don't have all day," he uttered. "It's what you're getting paid for, boy." A cleaner's boy's weekly wage at that time was £3 8 shillings and sixpence take-home pay. One day, Pat was asked if he would help the boiler washers, due to the fact that they were a man short, and decided to have a go. Pat enjoyed the company of these men, Tom Gormley and Paddy Burke, and when asked to repeat the experience, he readily agreed. It meant being paid labourer's rate in excess of £7 a week plus plenty of overtime. It was an extremely dirty job that lasted him for several months, but it was regular, and he, like my experience of working in the boilersmith shop, earned more wages than our fathers. The cost of labour for servicing and maintaining steam locomotives was relatively expensive. Employed for the task, excluding cleaners and locomotive crews, were running foremen, timekeepers, office boys, turntable men, steam raisers, a tube cleaner, boiler washers, fitters, fitters' mates, an ash loader, drain cleaners, boilersmiths, storesmen, coalmen, and of course office staff and the depot master and his assistant. For locomotives that needed running repairs, a driver's repair card was provided for the fault to be reported. The completed card would be placed in a box ready for attention wherever the engine was berthed. Most running repairs did not prevent the loco from entering traffic, and only required the services of a fitter's mate, for example cylinder cocks hung up, or vacuum brake adjusting, etc. Occasionally an engine would have to be stopped for leaking stays in the firebox, brick arch damage or broken piston rings. Shedmaster Mr. G.A.V. Stovald. Pat often wondered over the years why Mr. Stovald was so tolerant of cleaner boys. After all, he had ample opportunity to dismiss several during the years of 1957 to 58. Pat knew that theft was not tolerated and an employee was subject to instant dismissal for so indulging, but other than that, they were given a lot of rope. In later years, Pat learnt that Mr. Stovald's only son was killed whilst serving in the Royal Tank Regiment in France on the 27th of June 1944, aged just 20. Perhaps Mr. Stovald looked on the cleaners as siblings. Well after his retirement, Pat can remember seeing him striding into Guildford from his home in Onslow Village, head held high with a military bearing, trilby hat in place, his long coat flapping in the breeze. He started Pat in a lifelong career in the most interesting and enjoyable employment that he could have wished for. Mr. Stovald lived to the ripe old age of 95. The Snodland Cement. There was a time when Guildford men worked a heavy freight train which originated at Snodland in Kent and worked the train from Redhill to Reading. The diagram involved one pair of Guildford men finishing their duty by working the Snodland as far as Guildford and being relieved by another Guildford crew who worked the train forward to Reading, from where it carried on up country with another locomotive. The Reading to Redhill section was usually worked by an N-class locomotive, the maximum load for the road being equal to 60. The train largely consisted of box wagons carrying 100-weight bags of cement. The old saying was, if you can get them up Reigate Bank, you can get them up Pink's Hill, Guildford, but not always so. After stopping at Guildford to change crews and take water, it was a dead start from the platform. Sometimes there was no problem departing Guildford tackling Pink's Hill, the sound of the locomotive's beat being clearly heard in the early hours for a radius of several miles as she tackled the incline. But sadly, at times, the load was too much for the N, and she would come to a stand, usually just past the bypass bridge under the A3. Guildford crews often protested that the train was continually being overloaded, but their protests fell on deaf ears. The procedure then was to set back into Guildford Up Yard and uncouple some wagons. As the maximum load permitted for an N-class from the yard was only equal to 48, even more wagons had to be left behind. It was therefore decided to alter the crew diagrams, and instead of changing over at Guildford, the changeover should take place at Shalford, some 2 miles east of Guildford. There were also watering facilities at the station. A footplate inspector would accompany the crew to Reading for this experiment, the idea being to run through Guildford without stopping and charge Pink's Hill Bank. Come Monday morning at 2:30 a.m, everyone was at hand for the experiment. The train crew, including the guard, were ferried out to Shalford by Mr. Ford, Senior, the depot's contract taxi driver. Water having been taken at Shalford, a positive driver on the regulator, an experienced fireman on the shovel, and the inspector in jubilant mood, the locomotive moved forward slowly at first as she passed under the war-damaged Shalford Bridge, but was soon put to her paces with first regulator and the lever in the corner. Staff, Pat included, stood by the turntable in Guildford shed with great expectations, waiting for the Snodland to pass through. Soon they could hear the distant sound of the two-cylinder beat through the tunnel as the N crossed over Shalford Junction. Clearing the 20-mile-an-hour crossover, they could sense the regulator being put into the second valve, the cut-off being about 65%, Pat guesses. In the clear early morning air, listening to the beautiful exhaust of this two-cylinder engine entering the south portal of the 132-yard St Catherine's Tunnel, Pat thought it was very exciting. Then again, the sound of the exhaust in between tunnels, before plunging into the 845 yards chalk tunnel. What would this driver do? A permanent speed restriction of 20 miles an hour from the London end of Chalk Tunnel was in force. but needs must, and with no speedometer on this class of locomotive, a little driver's licence could be indulged in. Bursting forth from the north portal like a demon, steam and smoke blasting from the chimney, Pat thought it made a really impressive sight. Signalled through number 8 platform via a short curve, the locomotive passed the line-side loco turntable with onlookers aghast at the sight and sound of the mogul taking the bend with all wheels squealing as she led her charge of box wagons through the station. Not to be left out of this drama, the guard's van coal-fired stove, trembling in response to the rough ride through this point work, emitted a stream of sparks from the chimney, as though in response to the locomotive's rockets. The very sound of the exhaust, coupled with the noise of the short wheelbase wagons clattering over the points as the train gathered speed, the partly open firehole door allowing the glare of the fire to reflect from the exhaust steam, was a tremendous spectacle. Onwards they went, still gathering speed past Blanchard's block and under Yorkie's bridge. Just past Yorkie's, the N entered the sharp left-hand bend and began to ascend the 1 in 100 gradient towards the summit of Pink's Hill. Although our hero had a full head of steam, the heavy load and heading into the 1 in 100 gradient, combined with the sharp left-hand bend, reduced the speed as she approached the line-side Dennis's factory. Our willing horse started to struggle, and the exhaust beats gradually getting slower. Down to a walking pace now, the regulator in second valve and the lever in 75% cut-off, she strained every muscle to keep going. The audience, listening back in the loco shed, could hear the beat from the chimney as it was muffled under the bypass bridge. Shortly after, with a sigh, the train came to a standstill, without a single hint of wheel spin. The safety valves could be heard to lift almost immediately. What a disappointment for all concerned. There was nothing for it but to get permission to set back into Guildford Up Yard and reduce the load by a considerable amount. It was no good. Something would have to be done. Following the experiment, it was decided to take some of the discarded wagons over to the weigh table in the down yard to be checked for weight, where it was discovered that each wagon was severely overloaded. As stated earlier, the cement was loaded into the wagons in 100-weight bags. It was revealed that the cement company had indeed loaded far more bags into the wagons than was permitted, each wagon overloaded by several tons, making the train as a whole overloaded by as much as 100 tons or more. At least, Guildford crews had been vindicated. Until then, all complaints regarding overloading had been ignored. Firing School. When reaching the tender age of 16 years, cleaners were booked to attend the firing school as soon as it could be arranged. This was looked upon with knee-knocking trepidation, primarily because of the fear of failure, and secondly, because being passed out for firing duties changed your world dramatically. It meant that your lord and master was your driver, who became the kingpin both on and off the loco and was responsible for everything you did. Perhaps what made it worse for Pat was his Irish roots. He still had a distinctive Limerick accent in those days that became the butt of numerous jokes, so the fear of failure was the more poignant since he felt a need to prove himself more than the others. The firing school was held in the old orphanage hut at Guildford, adjacent to the builder's yard and coaling stage. It involved a fortnight of intensive classroom work with just a couple of hours engine disposal, but because the curriculum didn't include any preparation or running work, perhaps a day or two acting as a third man on the main line would have been advantageous. Pat's instructor was Mr. George Bolland, and he expected the trainees' full attention at all lessons. Back at the firing school, the format being first and foremost was the rule book, starting with Rule 55, protection, and to remind the signalman of the position of your train. OK, it was nice and neat in the classroom, but in practice it could be an entirely different kettle of fish. The second rule instilled was detonator protection, following a mishap or derailment, especially when the opposite line or lines are blocked. This included an assessment on which lines to protect in the event of multiple lines. After that came Rules 179180, which involved setting detonators, 1 at 1/4 of a mile, 1 at 1/2 a mile, and 3 at 3/4 of a mile, 10 yards apart. And if you're not sure about the distance, then count the telegraph poles. 8 poles to 1/4 of a mile. And don't forget to set detonators at both ends of tunnels and at junctions. Signalling recognition was also obviously very important, and what is little known at that time is that drivers were allowed 13 exceptions to ignore stop signals, and each one had to be thoroughly memorised. All this sudden responsibility being heaped onto young shoulders was quite alarming, and Pat was relieved to move on to the theory of firing duties for a change. What is smoke? Smoke is the unburnt carbon particles in the coal, sir. What is steam? Steam is an invisible elastic gas with great expansive properties, sir. And combustion? Combustion is the consuming by flame of the volatile gases released by applying heat to the fuel, and is brought about by the rapid chemical combination of the carbon in the coal with the oxygen in the atmosphere. Pat spent all evening learning that last one, was never asked it, and to cap it all, he was the only one in the class of 12 that bothered to even learn it. Pat was taught by his instructor that coal should only be the size of a man's fist. What a hope! In practice, you often got lumps of coal weighing about 100-weight that would become wedged in the hole on a bullied Pacific. This would then have to be broken up with a coal pick. Anyway, after passing out as past cleaners, Pat and colleagues were deemed trained enough to be handed over into the charge of various drivers when required. As far as Pat was concerned, it was a pretty concentrated course, and he was glad when it was finished. Following a fortnight at the school, apart from a couple of hours spent on engine disposal, Pat still had no tangible footplate experience on the running line. Therefore, practical skills had to be gained on the hoof, so to speak. After passing the exam to act as fireman when required, Pat and his colleagues returned to their cleaning duties at 70C and regularly speculated on who was to be the first driver and what the duty might be. Rumours abounded about the various drivers, some good, some bad, and others reputed to be terrifying. So it was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that they daily scanned the alteration sheet to see who amongst them had been booked a running turn, which were allocated on a seniority basis. Come the day, it happened to be Pat on a Friday when the Sunday sheet was posted, and he was alarmed to find he had been booked a special. Pat's mate was to be driver Davy, whom Pat had seen several times in passing whilst working at the shed, but never had the novelty of speaking to him. They were booked to travel passenger to Waterloo to relieve on a BR Standard Class 5 locomotive, with empties to Clapham Junction, then take her to Nine Elms and dispose of her before returning to Guildford on the Monday morning on the 03:40am paper train. Reporting to the Guildford office at the appointed time, Pat met Brian Davy, then in his mid-20s, whose first question was, "Have you got a tea can?" Oh yes, Pat was well prepared in that line. He had a billy can, tea, milk and sugar, and plenty of it. Brian turned out to be very pleasant, and as they travelled to the capital, he put Pat in the picture as regards to their duty. At Waterloo, they waited for the arrival of their charge from Southampton docks, and seeing her elegant entry into that great station, amid other locomotives on adjacent platforms, Pat thought was a great thrill. Here he was, just 16 years old, and already a part of a great organisation. All went well on their trip to the Elms, and after disposing of their loco, they were requested to take an N-class light to Guildford. This was much better than travelling home passenger, Pat thought, and so while Brian went to the stores to get some engine oil, he undertook his duties preparing the loco, which was in a dreadful state, and on Brian's return, Pat inquired what time were they booked to leave. "Just as soon as you're ready," Brian replied. As soon as he was ready. Up to a point, Pat always thought everything ran to a timetable, but it was all down to him. Pat's head started to swell with the importance of it all, and having not the faintest idea of how much coal to put in the firebox, he shovelled like hell, while softly humming Tony Bennett's Stranger in Paradise, which in his mind's eye is exactly where he was, a stranger in paradise, all lost in a wonderland. Meanwhile, Brian finished his oiling, and on regaining the footplate, realising the situation, stopped Pat from emptying the tender. Departing Nine Elms at 2 a.m, they were signalled down the main slow line for the entire journey, but even before they reached Clapham Junction, Pat was starting to get quite worried. Their charge was riding like a jackass with a nettle under its tail. Leaving that great junction behind, Brian increased speed at an alarming level, which in reality was probably no more than 50 miles an hour. But to Pat, it seemed like they were doing a ton. All he could do was grab hold of the handrail and watch their bucking bronco, he was reluctant to call it a locomotive, oscillating from side to side while the tender made a snapping motion at the cab floor, disgorging coal around their ankles. The wheels on this thing were not wheels, they were shaped like threepenny bits. It was the sort of ride that a thrill-seeker would have paid dearly for in a fairground. Bouncing up and down off the cab floor, Pat could just about reach the injector steam valve with his right hand, whereas the white knuckles on his left hand exposed his terror as he gripped onto the handrail for dear life. Pat was scared out of his wits, yet as he glanced towards driver Davy, desperately seeking reassurance, all he gave Pat was an occasional smile. Why is he smiling in a crisis like this? He's insane. Pat thought he was booked with a madman on his first running turn. Blooming office staff must have done this on purpose. Surbiton was passed in a flash. Then Walton-on-Thames. Semaphores came and went, still clear signals. Weybridge, West Weybridge, then West Byfleet. Semaphores all clear. Oh my goodness, Pat thought. Will this never end? Staring goggle-eyed into the distance, Pat could distinguish yellows at Woking. Speed was reduced to 20 miles an hour through the junction. Thank God for that, he thought. But no sooner had they emerged from the twin bridges by Woking Junction, steam again was applied to the cylinders. Brian shot him another pathological smile. For God's sake, what's the matter with this man? Couldn't he see that Pat was terrified? Descending Stoughton Bank into Guildford, Pat could just about make out the site of the cathedral and recognise where he was. No tower on the Angel at those days, mind you. Then, reducing speed appropriately, they passed under Yorkeys Bridge, and their charge settled down to a dignified canter through the platform and into the tunnel, where the unique tunnel signal displayed clear, ready for the shunt back into the loco. They had made it, but the relief Pat felt was mixed with the nagging uncertainty that the career he had chosen might not be the right one for him after all. Pat had serious doubts that he was equipped to make it as a fully fledged engineman, and promised himself that after he squared up, he would go home and write out his resignation, then hand it in later that day. But after sleeping on it, Pat decided to give it another try, and how glad he was that he did. Pat realised later that Brian was only doing what was an everyday occurrence to him, but it was Pat's first experience on a locomotive at speed. Brian is in his 90s now, and still fit and healthy, and Pat occasionally sees him, but he doesn't remember the episode. It was just another job to a professional engineman, but a wealth of experience for Pat.